When I hear somebody say that $1.5 million is only the bare minimum for retirement, my first instinct is not fear. It is suspicion, not because I think inflation is fake, not because I think healthcare is cheap, not because I think retirement is easy. It is because I have spent too much of my life watching how money gets framed in public. And I know a confidence trick when I see one. The trick is not always a lie. The trick is often a choice of emphasis. Take a number that sounds meaningful, wrap it in enough risk language, add inflation, longevity, rising costs, uncertainty, healthcare, market volatility, the possibility of living too long, the possibility of dying too early, and before long the audience is no longer hearing math, they are hearing inadequacy. That is what bothers me. There is a very subtle but very powerful industry in telling ordinary people that whatever they have saved is not enough yet, not enough safely, not enough unless they get more conservative, not enough unless they buy the next product, hire the next planner, worry a little longer, postpone a little longer, and accept that the finish line is always moving faster than they are. I do not like that framing. I never have, because once fear becomes the lens, almost any nest egg can be made to look small. 1 million feels inadequate, 1.5 million feels fragile, 2 million becomes a checkpoint. And before long, a person who should feel a great deal of pride for what they have built starts to feel late, underprepared, and foolish. That is not honest planning. That is emotional positioning. Now, let me be clear. I am not here to tell people to retire recklessly. I am not here to tell them inflation is harmless, or that sequence risk does not matter, or that healthcare cannot bite harder than expected. Those things are real. But good planning is supposed to clarify reality, not distort it. And in this case, what I think is happening is that a perfectly serious retirement conversation is being framed in a way that systematically leans toward discouragement. The statement goes something like this. A $1.5 million portfolio using a 3% withdrawal rate gives you about $45,000 a year. Add average Social Security of around $24,000, and now you are at about $69,000 a year. Then imply that this income has to carry you for 30, 35, maybe even 40 years. Then ask the audience whether that really sounds sufficient once inflation and healthcare are considered. You can see immediately why the conclusion feels tight. The structure was built to make it feel tight. Now, the first problem is not even the conclusion. The first problem is that the model is quietly blending two very different retirements and acting as though they are the same one. On one side, it wants the drama of early retirement. It talks about retiring in your 50s. It talks about a timeline that can stretch 40 years or longer. It wants the anxiety of a very long runway. But on the other side, it is using Social Security at roughly full retirement age around 67 and treating that as if it fits naturally into the same picture. Those are not the same retirement. If you are claiming Social Security at full retirement age, then you are no longer describing one uninterrupted 40-year retirement problem in the way the headline implies. You are describing two separate phases, and once you separate those phases, the entire emotional weight of the argument changes. That is where I want to begin. Not with the fear, with the structure. Suppose we take the spirit of the claim seriously. Let us assume the real subject is early retirement. Let us say someone retires at 55 with $1.5 million in investable assets. Not their primary residence, not a gross net worth padded with home equity, liquid investable wealth. I want you to pause right there. A person or household with $1.5 million in liquid investable assets is not standing on some bare minimum edge of retirement civilization. They are rare. They are not typical. They are not weakly prepared by any normal American standard. They are a liquid millionaire household. And by the time you isolate liquid investable wealth at that level, you are no longer talking about the average family down the block. You are generally talking about a household in roughly the top 2 to 4% by that measure. That matters. Because once the public conversation starts calling upper tier households bare minimum households, the purpose is no longer clarity. The purpose is intimidation. We also need to ask the next obvious question: how does a household get to $1.5 million in liquid assets by the mid-50s in the first place? Not theoretically, commonly. What did their earning history tend to look like? Again, not because every household is identical, they are not, but because wealth accumulation has a profile, and that profile tells us something about what their retirement income will probably look like later. Households that end up with this level of liquid net worth in their 50s or early 60s are rarely households that spent their entire working lives earning around the average wage. Not impossible, but uncommon. Much more often, these households had peak earning years in strong six-figure territory, in many cases several years or decades in those brackets that has consequences for Social Security. This is one of the most important places where the fear story quietly cheats. It uses average Social Security benefits as though they were naturally attached to a household that accumulated $1.5 million of liquid investment wealth by its mid-50s. That pairing is convenient for making the retirement picture look tight. It is not very realistic. Let me build a more grounded case. Suppose the household averaged $125,000 a year over the course of the working life. Not every year, of course, early years lower, late years higher. That is how careers tend to work. But use $125,000 as a long-run household average, split between two earners, maybe one averaging $75,000 and the other averaging $50,000. That is not extravagant. It is not fantasy. It is actually conservative relative to the kinds of households that often reach this level of liquid wealth. What would full retirement age Social Security look like in a case like that? The $75,000 earner might come in around $2,700 a month. The $50,000 earner might come in around $2,000 a month together. You are looking at something around $56,000 to $57,000 a year in Social Security, not $24,000 total. That changes the retirement picture immediately. Now notice what just happened before touching a portfolio. Once this household reaches Social Security age, it may already have more than $56,000 a year of guaranteed inflation, adjusted income, guaranteed inflation, adjusted before the portfolio does another thing. That is not some minor detail in the equation. That is the equation. And even if you tell me this is a one-earner household, I still do not naturally jump to the average benefit. A single earner who built a $1.5 million liquid portfolio by the mid-50s is very unlikely to have had a lifetime earnings profile that maps neatly onto a low to average Social Security check. The article's assumptions might be possible, but they are not the most probable real-world pairing. That is why I always say retirement math is not just arithmetic. It is biography. The numbers come from the life. Now let us move to the portfolio itself, because here again the framing matters. The whole argument leans on a 3% withdrawal rate as though that were simply the neutral, responsible baseline. I do not accept that. Not because 3% is impossible. You can use 3% if you want to be very conservative. But do not call it the natural baseline and then act surprised when the resulting income looks modest. If you squeeze the withdrawal rate low enough, any portfolio begins to look inadequate. The better question is what withdrawal assumptions are actually supported by the broader body of retirement research. And here the picture is much more interesting than the fear framing suggests. If you are using historical modeling over very long horizons, you get one kind of answer. If you are using more conservative forward-looking simulations, you get another. If you are willing to use flexible spending guardrails and behavior that resembles what actual retirees do, rather than pretending they never adjust, you get yet another answer. The point is not that there is one sacred number. The point is that a 3% fixed rate is not the only intellectually serious answer available for a 40-year horizon. A historically grounded fixed real withdrawal rate is often higher than 3%. Forward-looking Monte Carlo work may land somewhat lower, though still not necessarily as low as the most fearful framing implies. And when you allow for flexibility, which real humans do, starting spending power can go materially higher still. That is not recklessness. That is realism. Retirees are not robots. They do not generally insist on spending the exact same real amount forever, regardless of markets, age, health, or priorities. They adjust, they slow down, they spend differently in phases. That is how life actually works. So let me rebuild the retirement the right way, not as one giant undifferentiated 40-year problem. As phases, phase 1 is the bridge age 55 to 67. No Social Security yet, no pension assumed for simplicity. The portfolio is doing all the work. But this is not a lifetime income problem yet. It is a 12-year bridge problem. That distinction changes everything. Because when you only need to bridge 12 years, you do not need to treat every dollar as though it must serve the exact same purpose over the exact same horizon. Some dollars need to fund stability, some dollars need to fund longevity. That is why I like a bucket structure here. Call the first bucket the bridge bucket, maybe something like $900,000. That job is simple. Fund the first 12 years as safely and steadily as possible. That does not mean stuffing it all into cash under a mattress. It means structuring it for near-term spending. Some cash, some short-duration instruments, some bonds, some CDs perhaps, modest growth exposure if appropriate. But overall, this bucket's job is not heroics. Its job is reliability. Then take the other $600,000 and treat it differently. This is the longevity bucket. This money is not there to survive the next headline. It is there to grow through time, while the bridge bucket handles the early years. Now we are matching dollars to purpose, which is the entire point of planning. Imagine desired spending of $100,000 a year from age 55 onward. Many people hear that and panic immediately because they multiply quickly in their heads and think, well, 12 years at that level consumes almost the whole portfolio. Yes, in nominal terms, it is a significant draw. But the reason the panic is misplaced is that the portfolio is invested, not frozen. The bridge is not just a spending pile. The longevity assets are still compounding in the background. You are not carrying dead dollars through the whole period that matters. By the time this household gets to 67, the portfolio is not automatically at zero, not even close. Depending on returns and how the two-bucket design was managed, it may still sit somewhere around $900,000 to $1.2 million, perhaps more in stronger sequences and less in weaker ones, but it is very unlikely to have disappeared simply because the person lived from it for 12 years. Now phase 2 begins. Social Security turns on, and that is where the emotional tone of the whole retirement changes. Suppose the household wants to continue spending $100,000 a year. Now Social Security is providing around $56,700. That leaves a gap of only about $43,000 for the portfolio to cover. Read that sentence again because it is the sentence the fear-based version never wants to emphasize. Only about $43,000 for the portfolio to cover. Now ask yourself, what size portfolio is needed to support that gap at a 4% withdrawal rate? A little over $1 million does it at 5%. Something around the high 800s can do it. And where did we just estimate the portfolio might be after the bridge years? Somewhere around $900,000 to $1.2 million. In other words, once you stop blending timelines and start modeling the retirement like an actual life, not a scary headline, the whole thing starts to make sense. The plan works, not magically, not universally, not with no planning, but it works. And that is before we even account for a fact that many retirees know intuitively and many media framings conveniently ignore. Spending is not flat over retirement. People tend not to spend in a straight line. Early retirement may have active years, travel years, project years, generosity years. Later retirement may have slower years. Some costs go up, yes, especially healthcare in certain cases. But other spending categories shrink. Travel can slow, commuting disappears, work clothing disappears, households often become more selective. Many people do not maintain one constant real spending target for 35 or 40 years. They move through retirement phases just as they move through career phases. That does not mean planning should be casual. It means planning should be honest. Now, if you ask me what kind of actual spending range looks realistic for an early retiree household with $1.5 million at 55, I would not tell you the answer is one grim little number. I would think in bands. A more conservative range might be $80,000 to $90,000 a year. A more balanced range might be $90,000 to $110,000 a year. And if the retiree is flexible, willing to pull back in weaker years and spend more in stronger ones, then a somewhat more aggressive spending band can also be plausible. That is not fantasy. That is what happens when the assumptions are internally consistent. And here is what really bothers me about the scare framing. It takes a household that has accomplished something objectively difficult, building $1.5 million of liquid wealth by the mid-50s, and it translates that accomplishment into a message of insufficiency. It does that by using a very low withdrawal rate. It does that by underestimating Social Security relative to the likely earnings history. It does that by blending early retirement and full retirement age benefit assumptions into one gray cloud. And then it presents the result as if the audience has just learned something sobering about retirement reality. What they have really learned is how easy it is to make any number look small if your assumptions are loaded in one direction. Now let me say something important here. A $1.5 million portfolio is not magic. It is not a golden key. It does not guarantee luxury. It does not excuse bad planning. It does not immunize someone against bad markets, poor tax decisions, excess spending, healthcare shocks, family obligations, or the 100 little ways life refuses to cooperate with spreadsheets. But it is also not some bare minimum joke. It is not just a checkpoint in the dismissive sense. It is a very serious level of liquid wealth. And if you pair it with a realistic earnings history, a realistic Social Security estimate, a realistic two-phase retirement framework, and a realistic understanding of how people actually spend over time, it can support a very real retirement, even an early one. That is why I resist the psychology of always moving the goalpost. People need realism. Yes, but realism is not the same thing as chronic discouragement. Realism tells you to run the numbers on your actual life. It tells you to look at your desired spending, your claiming strategy, your tax structure, your healthcare needs, your investment mix, your willingness to adjust. Realism does not tell every person with a large nest egg that they are still basically underprepared unless they keep climbing. That is not realism. That is a worldview, and it is a worldview that serves anxiety much better than it serves retirees. If you want my opinion, a person retiring at 55 with $1.5 million in liquid assets should not start with the question, is this secretly nothing? They should start with a better question. What job do I need each dollar to do over what phase of retirement? And what other income streams arrive later to change the burden on the portfolio? That is the right question. Because once you ask that one, the whole retirement picture becomes much less theatrical and much more usable. You move from vague fear to structure. You move from headline anxiety to actual planning. And in personal finance, structure is usually where peace begins. So no, I do not accept the idea that $1.5 million is just a bare minimum by default, not as a blanket statement, not when the underlying assumptions are doing so much hidden work. What I accept is something simpler and much more useful. For the right household, with the right earnings history, with the right Social Security expectation, with the right bridge strategy, and with the right flexibility, $1.5 million can support a very real retirement. And once people understand that, something important happens. They stop treating retirement as a media narrative and start treating it as what it actually is, a solvable planning problem. That is a much healthier way to think. And I've always found that healthier thinking usually leads to better decisions than fear ever does.